Ancient Egypt, a land cradled by the steady rhythm of the Nile, flourished quietly for thousands of years. Its history was not just of pharaohs and pyramids, but of farmers, scribes, and everyday people who moved to the calm heartbeat of a river that never failed them. The Nile did not just water their crops, it watered their time, their beliefs, and their view of the world. Most Egyptians never traveled far. Their lives began and ended in the same stretch of land, between the river and the desert. These narrow strips of green were the lifeline of civilization. Flooding occurred regularly, bringing rich silt and nourishing the farmland. So regular was this process that people counted their year in 3 seasons: Ake, the season of inundation; Parait, the season of emergence; and Shimu, the season of harvest. These seasons defined not only farming, but the cadence of life. Homes in ancient Egypt were simple. Made of mud brick, they kept out heat during the day and stayed surprisingly warm at night. The layout was plain, with 1 or 2 rooms, a rooftop, and a small courtyard. Windows were high and small to keep sunlight from flooding in. Inside, one might find a small wooden table, sleeping mats made of woven reeds, and pottery for holding bread and water. Wealthier homes were similar in structure, though larger, with painted walls and small gardens. People rose early, often before the sun. The day was ruled by natural light. Oil lamps were used at night, but they were expensive to maintain. Breakfast was simple: bread, sometimes sweetened with dates, and beer, which was a thick, nutritious brew made from fermented grain. Contrary to modern assumptions, this beer was often consumed by everyone, men, women, and even children, as it was considered safer than river water. Men worked in the fields, or served as craftsmen, fishermen, or builders. Their labor was predictable, rotating with the Nile. During the flood season, there was little work to be done on the land, so people often served in labor projects, working on temples, canals, or storage buildings. These were not slaves. Most were paid laborers, compensated with grain, beer, and sometimes linen. Women ran the household. They prepared meals, raised children, and managed storage. Women in Egypt enjoyed more rights than in many other ancient societies. They could own property, inherit wealth, and even bring cases to court. They were educated enough to run businesses or serve as priestesses. Children played with toys carved from wood or molded from clay. Balls made from leather, dolls with hair of string, and spinning tops were common. They helped with chores but also spent long afternoons in shade, resting or listening to stories from elders. Education was rare and usually limited to the sons of scribes or officials. Learning to read and write was a specialized craft, and scribes held a highly respected position in society. Writing was done using hieroglyphics, a complex system of pictorial symbols. Scribes were trained from a young age to master hundreds of signs, and they used papyrus scrolls, reed pens, and black or red ink made from crushed minerals. Red ink was reserved for headers and important words. A mistake could not be erased, so accuracy was critical. Time was measured differently. People followed the sun, the stars, and the movement of the river. The calendar was a practical tool rather than a strict schedule. There were festivals to honor gods, but daily life moved slowly, peacefully, with little variation. Each day folded gently into the next. Religion was deeply embedded in everything. It was not a separate part of life, it was life. The gods were many, and each served a specific function. Ra sailed across the sky each day in his solar boat. Osiris ruled the afterlife. Isis protected children and families. There were crocodile gods, vulture goddesses, and cats who were worshipped for their grace and protection. Temples were not only places of worship. They were schools, granaries, and banks. Priests followed strict rituals, including purification, fasting, and offerings. Ordinary people did not enter the inner sanctums of temples. They prayed outside, brought food or flowers as gifts, and hoped for blessings. The people believed that life continued after death, but only if the right steps were followed. Mummification was a part of this process, but it was expensive and mostly reserved for the wealthy. Common people might be buried in shallow graves with their belongings, hoping their ka, their spiritual double, would find peace. Tombs were not places of sadness. They were carefully planned, with food, tools, and charms meant to comfort the soul in the afterlife. Spells from the Book of the Dead were written on walls or scrolls, meant to guide the deceased through the dangers of the underworld. Trade brought calm continuity. Egypt traded with Nubia, the Levant, and across the Red Sea. Goods like incense, gold, and cedar wood came in, while grain, linen, and papyrus went out. Boats moved slowly on the Nile, driven by wind or poles, and their rhythm was as steady as the seasons. Art was not for expression, it was for order. Scenes were painted in profile, colors were consistent, and proportions followed rules. Art was meant to preserve balance, to keep things as they should be. Even the statues had symmetry and calm. Justice was rooted in ma'at, the principle of harmony and truth. Courts were led by officials or the vizier, and both men and women could bring a case. Witnesses were called, and the goal was not just punishment, but the restoration of balance. Theft, slander, and dishonesty were seen as disruptions to this balance. Pharaohs ruled as divine intermediaries. They were gods on earth, but also caretakers of the people. Their role was to maintain ma'at, to keep floods coming, temples functioning, and enemies at bay. A good pharaoh was remembered with monuments. A bad one might be erased from history entirely. And through it all, the Nile flowed. Its soft currents, gentle winds, and rhythmic floods cradled Egypt like a lullaby. Life here was not always peaceful, but it was deeply rooted. The people did not rush. They did not worry about faraway places. They lived with the seasons, honored the gods, and believed in a journey that extended beyond the grave. Part 2: Pharaohs, Temples, and the Royal Machine. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh stood at the top of all things. A ruler, a god, a symbol of stability. Though often depicted with grandeur, the pharaoh's purpose was quiet and clear: to keep order. The Egyptian world did not value chaos or ambition. It valued balance, and the pharaoh was seen as the human embodiment of that balance. The word pharaoh came from parae, meaning great house. It originally referred to the palace, but over time, it came to mean the person who ruled from within it. The pharaoh was the axis around which the world turned. Not because he controlled all things by force, but because people believed his role held everything together. When a pharaoh spoke, it was law. When he died, the world paused. When he ruled well, floods came on time, the granaries stayed full, and the temples remained calm. A good pharaoh didn't need to conquer. He only needed to maintain what already was. Pharaohs began their training early. From a young age, a royal son learned reading, writing, religious duties, and court etiquette. He watched the viziers and priests work. He learned the names of the gods, the roles of each official, and the rituals that kept the state running smoothly. By the time he inherited the throne, he was not only king, but caretaker of tradition. The palace was not always grand. It was functional. Made of mud brick like many buildings in Egypt, it was large but not built to impress outsiders. Columns, painted walls, and enclosed courtyards created shade. Inside, the pharaoh lived with his family, advisors, scribes, and guards. There were gardens and pools to cool the dry heat. Everything was quiet, ordered, and centered on protocol. The royal court was more than a group of nobles. It was the machinery of the state. The vizier, or chief advisor, acted like a prime minister. He oversaw legal matters, tax collection, public works, and the protection of the pharaoh's will. Scribes recorded every meeting, decree, and shipment. Temple officials managed grain, workers, and land. Judges and regional governors, called nomarchs, reported in with updates from the provinces. Communication moved slowly but surely. Messages were carried by boat or runner. Reports came on papyrus scrolls, sealed with clay and tied with linen. Decisions were not rushed. A problem in one region might take weeks to reach the capital, and weeks more to resolve. This was not seen as inefficient. It was seen as proper. Patience kept the world in balance. Temples were not just religious sites. They were the lifeblood of the state. Each major god had one or more temples, and each temple employed hundreds of workers. There were farmers to work temple land, cooks to prepare offerings, carpenters to repair buildings, and musicians to perform hymns. The high priest, often appointed by the pharaoh himself, acted as both spiritual leader and economic administrator. The largest temples were in Thebes, at Karnak and Luxor. These were built over centuries, with massive columns and open courtyards. Reliefs on the walls showed kings offering to the gods. Columns were carved with lotus and papyrus designs, linking the temple with the life-giving Nile. Yet these places were not busy with crowds. They were greetings, alliances, and polite discussions of trade. Egyptian rulers sent gold and linen. They received lapis lazuli, horses, and timber. Daughters were married to kings in far-off lands. Sons of nobles came to Egypt to learn its ways. And through all of this, the pharaoh remained still. His image carved into temple walls showed him the same way, every time, calm, young, victorious. Even if he was old or ill, the image did not change. Because the pharaoh was not just a person. He was a principle. A symbol of eternity. Even in death, pharaohs were bound by tradition. Their tombs were built long before they died. Architects and craftsmen worked in secret valleys, carving chambers, painting walls, and preparing grave goods. The tomb was not just a resting place. It was a machine for rebirth. Tombs were filled with food, clothes, furniture, weapons, and charms. They included painted scenes of the afterlife, where the pharaoh would sail on a boat, meet the gods, and be judged. The Book of the Dead, filled with protective spells, was placed beside him. If all went well, he would be reborn among the stars. In this way, ancient Egypt moved forward. Not with haste. Not with conquest. But with quiet discipline, steady faith, and a deep belief in the harmony of all things. Part 3, The Everyday People, Work, Family, and Simple Joys. Life for the average Egyptian was simple, repetitive, and deeply connected to the land. While history often celebrates the rulers and temples, it was the labor of ordinary people that made Egypt's longevity possible. These were the farmers, builders, artisans, and caretakers of the Nile Valley. Their lives unfolded gently, shaped by cycles rather than ambition. The backbone of Egypt's economy was agriculture. Most Egyptians lived in small villages clustered along the Nile. Their homes were made of sun-dried mud bricks and built close to one another. There were no streets, only narrow paths. Chickens, goats, and donkeys wandered freely. Shade was precious, and so was stillness. Men rose early to work in the fields. They wore simple linen kilts or loincloths and worked barefoot. Tools were basic, wooden plows pulled by oxen, sickles with flint blades, and baskets woven from reeds. Fields were planted with wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables. The flood season brought silt and water. Then came planting, followed by months of quiet tending. Harvests were stored in communal granaries, guarded and managed by scribes. Fishing was common too. Men cast nets from small reed boats or fished with harpoons in shallow water. The Nile gave generously. Tilapia, catfish, and eels were staple catches. These were salted or dried to be eaten later. Craftsmen worked in workshops, often attached to temples or noble households. There were potters, weavers, jewelers, stonemasons, and carpenters. Each trade was taught from father to son, passed down with care. Tools were handmade, and tasks repeated daily. Nothing was rushed. Quality mattered more than speed. Potters shaped bowls and jars from clay pulled from the Nile's banks. They used foot-powered wheels and fired their wares in simple kilns. Weavers made linen from flax, bleaching it in the sun and spinning it into thread. The linen was light, cool, and clean, ideal for the desert climate. Carpenters made furniture from imported wood, acacia, sycamore, or cedar. Beds, stools, chests, and doorframes were common. They used bronze tools, wooden mallets, and string to measure angles. Stonemasons shaped blocks for temples and tombs. Even though they worked with hard materials, their movements were slow, deliberate, and thoughtful. Ink was made from soot and water, applied with a reed pen. Religion was present, but not overpowering. People honored local gods with small offerings. They wore amulets for protection, recited prayers for health, and followed rituals at birth, marriage, and death. The afterlife was not a distant mystery but a natural continuation of life. What you did in this life echoed in the next. Work was hard, but not frantic. Time was measured in floods, harvests, and festivals. There was a comfort in the routine. People knew their role and trusted the cycles of the world. When the sun rose, work began. When it set, work stopped. Fires were lit. Bread was shared. Stories were told. and sleep came easily. Death, when it came, was met with dignity. The body was washed and wrapped. If possible, it was buried with a few belongings and a small offering. Inscriptions were simple. He was a good man. She was kind to her children. The hope was not for greatness, but peace. Even in the cities, the pace was calm. The capital moved with order. Officials filed reports. Traders weighed goods. Scribes recorded grain, taxes, and census lists. Soldiers drilled quietly in the open courts. Priests tended to temples with rhythmic devotion. And across it all, the Nile continued its ancient flow. Egypt, for all its monuments, was not built in glory but in repetition. In simple tasks, done well. In people waking each day to do what was needed. Their names are forgotten, but their lives held the land together. There were no headlines, no revolutions. Just steady hands. Silent prayers. And the quiet hum of a civilization that lasted longer than most can imagine. Part 4, The Afterlife, Mummification, and the Journey Beyond. In ancient Egypt, death was not an end but a passage. It was neither feared nor avoided. It was prepared for with the same care as any other stage of life. The Egyptians believed in a life beyond death, a life that mirrored the one they lived, with food, family, music, and fields under the sun. But reaching that afterlife required a journey, and that journey had many steps. Central to this belief was the idea of the Ka, the spiritual essence of a person. At the moment of death, the Ka would leave the body but needed a place to return to. That place was the preserved body itself. To make sure the Ka could find and recognize it, the body had to be protected. This gave rise to the long and careful process of mummification. Mummification was not only for kings. Wealthy officials, priests, and respected families also underwent the ritual. For common people, simpler forms of burial were practiced. But the principle remained the same, to prepare the body for eternity. The process of mummification lasted 70 days. It began with cleansing. The body was washed with water from the Nile. Then, an incision was made in the side to remove the internal organs, which were cleaned, dried, and stored in separate canopic jars. Each jar was protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus, Imsidi, Hapi, Duamutef, and Kabesanuf. The brain was removed through the nose using a hooked tool. It was discarded, as the Egyptians believed that thought and identity came from the heart, not the brain. The heart, in many cases, was left inside the body, as it was considered essential for judgment in the afterlife. The empty body was packed with natron, a naturally occurring salt, to draw out moisture. For 40 days, it rested in a dry chamber, slowly transforming. Afterward, the body was washed again, packed with linen or sawdust to restore its shape, and wrapped in layer upon layer of fine linen strips. Between layers, charms and amulets were placed to protect the soul. The final wrappings included a mask placed over the face. These masks, made of painted cartonnage or even gold, helped the spirit recognize its former self. Hands were crossed over the chest. The body, now a mummy, was placed in a coffin, often nested within more than one. The innermost coffin held inscriptions and protective spells. The outermost was decorated with scenes of the gods and the journey ahead. Funeral ceremonies were held with family and priests in attendance. Offerings were made, and prayers recited. Inscriptions on the tombs called out to passers-by, asking them to speak the name of the deceased, to keep their memory alive. Even the act of remembering was a sacred gesture. But the soul's journey was only beginning. The Egyptians believed the soul would enter the Duat, the realm of the dead. It was not a place of torment, but a landscape filled with rivers, gates, and guardians. The deceased had to pass through these obstacles, guided by spells from the Book of the Dead. These spells were not secret. They were copied, sold, and personalized for each individual. The most important moment came at the Hall of Two Truths. There, the deceased would stand before Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and the 42 divine judges. The heart of the deceased was weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth and balance. If the heart was light, unburdened by sin, the soul passed on to eternal life. If it was heavy, it was devoured by the monstrous Ammit, and the soul would cease to exist. To ensure a favorable judgment, people often included a special spell, Spell 125, from the Book of the Dead. It was a series of declarations, known as the negative confession. The deceased would claim, "I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not killed. I have not spoken ill of the gods." These statements were not just for show. They reflected the moral ideals of Egyptian life. Once judged worthy, the soul entered the field of reeds, a paradise that resembled the best parts of life on earth. There were fields to farm, trees to rest under, and loved ones reunited. The sun shone gently, and the Nile flowed calmly. In this eternal Egypt, there was no sickness, no hunger, and no sorrow. Tombs were designed as homes for the dead. They included food, tools, furniture, and clothing. Scenes painted on the walls showed the deceased hunting, fishing, and feasting. These images were not for memory, they were believed to become real in the afterlife. Spells, prayers, and offerings were inscribed to sustain the spirit for eternity. For the kings and queens, tombs were grander. Pyramids were the earliest royal tombs, built during the Old Kingdom. These massive structures, made of limestone and granite, were aligned with the stars and the sun. Later, in the New Kingdom, pharaohs were buried in hidden tombs carved deep into the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings. These tombs were painted with elaborate scenes of the journey through the underworld. But over time, tombs were robbed, mummies disturbed, and treasures taken. Still, the rituals persisted. Even when power shifted, when dynasties rose and fell, the belief in the afterlife remained strong. The focus was never on the treasure itself, but on the preparation, the intention, and the quiet hope that the soul would find peace. There were no loud declarations, no fire and brimstone. Only the gentle guidance of spells, the protection of gods, and the slow unfolding of a spiritual journey that mirrored the Nile's flow, steady, eternal, and serene. To the Egyptians, a good life was one that left the world in balance. A good death was one that honored tradition. And a good afterlife was one where the soul returned to harmony. Part 5, Inventions, Legacy, and the Quiet Power of Simplicity. Ancient Egypt was not built in haste, nor did it rise through conquest alone. It grew slowly, generation by generation, layer by layer. Its people did not rush toward innovation, but allowed change to settle in gently, like sediment on the banks of the Nile. And yet, through this slow and steady path, they built a civilization whose influence still lingers quietly in the background of the modern world. Much of what Egyptians invented was not grand or loud, but practical and thoughtful. Their achievements were not always breakthroughs, but refinements of what had come before. They observed, adapted, and perfected. One of their greatest contributions was the calendar. Based on the stars and the flooding of the Nile, they divided the year into 12 months of 30 days each, with 5 extra days added to align with the solar year. Each season, inundation, emergence, and harvest, fit naturally into this system. It was not about precision. It was about harmony with the natural world. They developed early forms of mathematics, used not to theorize but to build. Geometry helped them measure land after floods, align walls, and design structures. Multiplication, division, and simple fractions were used in daily tasks like dividing grain or measuring cloth. Their numbers were written with lines and symbols, simple, repetitive, and easy to learn. Medicine, too, was advanced for its time. Egyptian doctors understood the body through experience. They used honey to prevent infection, treated wounds with herbs, and performed basic surgeries. Medical texts, such as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, contained case studies and treatment suggestions. Their remedies were not magical incantations, but careful observations paired with ritual. The line between science and spirituality was soft, not sharp. Papyrus, their writing material, came from the reeds of the Nile. It was sliced, pressed, and dried into sheets, light, flexible, and portable. With it came scrolls, libraries, and a new way of preserving thought. It allowed scribes to record not just taxes and temple rituals, but stories, prayers, and ideas. Writing itself was both art and communication. Hieroglyphs were more than letters, they were images with meaning. A bird, a wave, a seated man. These symbols told stories slowly, with purpose. Later, a more practical script called hieratic was developed for everyday use, simpler, faster, and better suited for accounting or correspondence. Architecture was where Egyptian patience shone the brightest. Temples, tombs, and monuments were built not for speed, but for permanence. Builders planned years ahead. Stones were cut precisely and placed with care. They did not rely on advanced machinery. They relied on manpower, coordination, and time. The pyramids of Giza, still standing after 4,000 years, were not just royal tombs. They were symbols of stability, scaled geometry, and silent power. Inside, the chambers were plain, not lavish. Their beauty came from proportion, not decoration. Temples like Karnak and Abu Simbel were aligned with the sun. At specific times of year, sunlight would reach deep into their sanctuaries, illuminating statues of gods. This was not a trick, it was trust in the cosmos, in cycles, and in craftsmanship. Even art was shaped by order. Scenes followed a grid. Figures were drawn with standard proportions. People were shown in profile, with heads, shoulders, and feet carefully aligned. Colors were symbolic: green for life, red for power, black for fertility. There was no emphasis on realism, only on clarity. What mattered was not what was seen, but what was understood. Egypt's legacy extended beyond its borders. Through trade and travel, its ideas spread quietly. To Nubia, where temples and writing systems were adapted. To the Levant, where Egyptian goods and architecture left impressions. To Greece, whose scholars visited and learned from Egyptian priests. And through Greece, to Rome, and beyond. The Greeks respected Egyptian knowledge. Philosophers like Pythagoras, Plato, and Herodotus admired their wisdom, though much of what they recorded was second-hand. Egyptian temples became places of mystery and study. The goddess Isis, once local to the Nile, was worshipped across the Mediterranean. The Ankh, the scarab, and the Eye of Horus became symbols beyond Egypt's own borders. But Egypt itself did not seek expansion through force. Its diplomacy was subtle, built on trade, gifts, and arranged marriages. Foreign visitors were welcomed, shown temples, and treated with courtesy. Language barriers were bridged with scribes. Disputes were settled with compromise. Even as empires rose and fell around them, the Egyptians continued their rituals. They worshipped in the same temples, followed the same calendar, and buried their dead with the same care. Change did come. Persians, Greeks, and Romans would all rule Egypt in time. But for centuries, the essence of Egyptian life remained the same. This longevity was not a result of military strength or aggressive rule. It came from a culture rooted in rhythm. The Nile rose and fell. The sun crossed the sky. The stars rotated gently above. And the people lived in step with these movements. What they left behind was not a single invention or idea, but a way of thinking. A quiet confidence in slow progress. A belief in harmony. A trust in rituals, and in the unseen. Their achievements were not shouted. They were carved into stone, buried with care, and passed on gently through time. Even now, as tourists walk among their ruins and scholars read their scrolls, the story of Egypt unfolds slowly. It does not rush to reveal itself. It waits patiently, in silence, just as it always has. Part 6, A Slow Sunset, Egypt's Gentle Decline. No civilization lasts forever. But few civilizations have declined as slowly, as quietly, or as gracefully as ancient Egypt. There was no single moment when its greatness ended. No loud collapse, no sudden fall. Instead, Egypt drifted from prominence the same way a river leaves behind an old course, steadily, peacefully, and with barely a sound. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt had already existed for nearly 2,000 years. Pharaohs still ruled, temples were still maintained, and rituals still carried on. But slowly, change began to seep in, not through destruction, but through fatigue. The power of the pharaoh began to weaken. The court grew divided. Priests of Ammonius, once loyal supporters of the king, began to grow more powerful than the king himself. Resources thinned, foreign threats became harder to manage, and unity gave way to local control. Egypt was no longer one voice. It became a chorus of smaller voices, each doing its part, but no longer in perfect harmony. The late period saw brief revivals. Strong kings like Psamtik and Nectanebo tried to restore the old ways. They repaired temples, reinforced borders, and honored the gods. But time moved forward, and the world changed. Egypt remained still, and stillness, once its strength, began to feel like resistance. Outside powers began to look toward the Nile. First, the Assyrians arrived. then the Persians. Their rule brought new customs, but also respect for Egypt's traditions. They did not seek to erase Egyptian culture. They allowed it to continue, albeit under new names and unfamiliar kings. Then came Alexander the Great. When he entered Egypt in 332 BCE, he was welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Egyptians saw in him a new pharaoh, a restorer of balance. He founded the city of Alexandria, not far from the mouth of the Nile, and left Egypt in the hands of his general, Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic dynasty, Greek in origin, ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. They adopted many Egyptian customs, temple building, divine kingship, religious festivals. Their rule was a fusion of Greek and Egyptian worlds. Pharaohs spoke Greek in court, but wore the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt in temples. They were foreign, but familiar. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria flourished. It became a center of learning, home to the famous Library of Alexandria, a place of scrolls, scholars, and quiet thought. It was a new kind of Egypt, urban, cosmopolitan, and curious. But it was no longer the Egypt of pyramids, hieroglyphs, and ritual harvests. Then came Rome. When Cleopatra, the last Ptolemaic ruler, stood beside Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, Egypt's fate became tied to Roman politics. After her death in 30 BCE, Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire, not as a partner, but as a province. Rome brought roads, garrisons, and governors. Temples continued to operate, and many Romans admired Egypt's spiritual depth. But Latin replaced Greek in administration, and slowly, Egyptian writing fell out of use. Hieroglyphs, once sacred and alive, faded from the walls. Papyrus scrolls were stored and forgotten. Religion, too, changed. Old gods were worshipped for a while longer. Temples still held ceremonies. But new faiths arrived, first Greco-Roman cults, then Christianity. The old beliefs, once the center of all life, became memories. And yet, Egypt did not resist. The people adapted. Farmers still tended to the land. Potters still shaped clay. Children still learned from their parents. The Nile still flooded. Life went on, but the rituals that once connected earth to heaven slowly faded from daily life. Even after the rise of Islam in the 7th century, Egypt remained a land of quiet strength. Mosques replaced temples. Arabic replaced Greek and Coptic. But the patience of the people endured. They had seen change before. They knew how to bend, not break. For centuries, Egypt's monuments lay buried under sand. Its scrolls were scattered. Its language forgotten. But the people remained. And in time, explorers, scholars, and dreamers returned. In the 19th century, when hieroglyphs were finally deciphered by Jean-François Champollion, the voice of ancient Egypt began to speak again. Tombs were opened. Temples restored. Museums filled with artifacts once left untouched. But even now, with all we know, much remains a mystery. The names of kings are carved in stone. The outlines of rituals are recorded. But the thoughts of ordinary people, the sounds of their laughter, the rhythm of their lives, these are lost in time, like the breeze over the desert. And perhaps that is fitting. Egypt's legacy is not in action, but in endurance. Not in conquest, but in continuity. While other empires burned bright and vanished, Egypt flowed like the Nile, steady, slow, and everlasting. Its story is not one of sudden triumphs or dramatic collapses. It is a story of patient lives, lived in balance with nature, under the watchful eyes of gods who never shouted, only whispered. Today, as the sun rises over the Valley of the Kings, as tourists walk among the pillars of Karnak, and as the Nile continues its endless journey, Egypt still lives, not in power, but in presence. Its greatness lies not in its end, but in how long it took to reach it. And in how gently it faded, leaving behind not noise, but silence. Part 7, The Rhythm of the Nile, a gentle return to daily life. If you stood by the Nile thousands of years ago, you would not hear noise or shouting. You would hear the soft splash of oars in the water. The rustle of reeds in the breeze. The distant hum of voices, low and steady, as men cast their nets or guided oxen through wet fields. Ancient Egypt was not made of battles and glory. It was made of days. Long, slow days. Days that began at sunrise and ended when the air cooled and shadows stretched long across the sand. The heart of Egypt was always the river. Not the throne. Not the temples. But the Nile itself. It flowed without urgency, bending through the desert, bringing life wherever it reached. People settled along its banks not because it promised riches, but because it promised rhythm. In the early morning, the air was cool and still. Farmers walked barefoot through the damp earth, leading animals, checking crops. Birds darted over canals. The smell of soil and water filled the air. Children gathered kindling. Women lit fires to bake the day's bread, flat, dense loaves made with emmer wheat, baked on hot stones. By mid-morning, the village was awake. Tools clinked. Rope was braided. Pots turned on wheels. Some people shaped papyrus into scrolls. Others pounded grain or spun flax into thread. There was no rush. Only repetition. Only the quiet comfort of tasks done the same way for generations. Lunch was simple: bread, beer, dates, perhaps fish if the catch was good. People sat on the ground. They ate in silence or in soft conversation. No music. No feasting. Just food and shade. In the heat of the day, the world slowed. Work paused. People rested under trees or inside mud-brick homes. The breeze off the Nile was soft, barely enough to stir a hanging reed mat. Cats slept. Chickens scratched in dry corners. As the sun lowered, life resumed. Farmers returned to fields to water crops. Sailboats passed by, their single white sails catching the light. The air smelled of clay and warm water. Smoke curled from cooking fires. Evening brought gathering. Men returned home. Children played. Meals were prepared: lentil stew, leeks, onions, and boiled beans. Families sat together. Grandparents told stories. Not myths of gods, but tales of their own youth. Of years when the Nile flooded high. Or of a winter when the harvest was thin, and still they made it through. There were no clocks in ancient Egypt. No appointments. No alarms. Only the sun and the stars. When the last light faded, oil lamps were lit. Homes glowed softly from within. Conversations grew fewer. Sleep came early. People did not fear the dark. They had lived with it always. The sky above was wide, quiet, filled with familiar constellations. They believed that the goddess Nut swallowed the sun each evening and gave birth to it again every morning. Night was not danger. It was rest. Children lay on woven mats, listening to the wind outside. Some households sang lullabies, slow, melodic chants passed down from mother to daughter. Some recited small prayers to keep the ka safe while it wandered in sleep. These were not dramatic moments. Just habits. Like brushing away sand from the doorstep. Or storing grain in tightly sealed jars. Dreams, if they came, were thought to be messages. Most were ignored. Only a few were recorded. Not in grand tomes, but on scraps of pottery or the back of temple walls. In many homes, small shrines were kept, simple shelves with a statue or amulet. Offerings of bread or flowers were placed there each week. These gods were not distant. They were familiar. Present. They watched over childbirth, farming, and sleep. Festivals arrived quietly. A day of rest. A special meal. A walk to the local temple. People wore clean linen. They carried baskets of figs, beer, and incense. There were no loud parades. Just reverence. And a shared sense that the world, though wide and mysterious, was still understandable. Across generations, very little changed. A boy who planted wheat at age 10 would teach his son to do the same at 40. A woman who shaped clay jars in her youth would pass the technique to her granddaughter without altering it. Change was slow. And that slowness was a kind of wisdom. Even in cities, life followed the same tide. Markets bustled during harvest. Boats delivered papyrus, oils, and fabrics. But the pulse of the city still matched the river. People rose with the sun. They closed shops when shadows grew long. They bowed before the same gods and whispered the same blessings before sleep. Death, too, was expected. Not feared. Funerals were quiet. The body was washed. Prayers were recited. A shabby figurine was placed in the coffin to serve the deceased in the afterlife. No fanfare. Just faith that life would continue elsewhere. For most Egyptians, life was not measured by achievement, but by balance. Were the granaries full? Were the children safe? Did the floods come as expected? Did the village live in peace? They did not seek greatness. They sought calm. They measured success not in monuments, but in days without hardship. In years where no one went hungry. In mornings when the Nile shimmered blue and green and gold. Their world was small, but full. Full of purpose, of connection, of quiet joy. They knew their neighbors. They knew the wind. They knew the land. And now, even as centuries have passed, their quiet life still echoes in the stones of old villages, in the soft curve of a pot, in the faded script of a temple wall. Not every history must be loud to matter. Some histories, like Egypt's, are better told softly. Part 8, The Endless Stillness of Time. As we near the end of our quiet journey through ancient Egypt, it's worth pausing, gently, without urgency, to look back at what made this civilization endure. Not the pyramids. Not the gold. But the silence. The patience. The way life flowed like the river they cherished. Egypt was not a land of hurry. It moved with rhythm, not reaction. Its greatest power was not in conquest, but in continuity. Through centuries of floods, kings, scribes, traders, and artisans, life pulsed at the same slow pace. That slow pace, that deep stillness, is what still whispers to us across thousands of years. What they valued was not innovation for its own sake, but balance. They honored Ma'at, the concept of truth, justice, and harmony, not just as a goddess, but as a way of being. They did not rush to build faster or conquer farther. They perfected what they already had. They repeated what worked. They trusted what endured. And so, day after day, year after year, the people of Egypt lived their lives as though eternity was not far off, but already here. The sunrise wasn't a novelty. It was a reminder. A confirmation that the world was still turning as it should. The Nile's return was not luck, but a promise fulfilled again and again. Even in their writings, time felt different. In their hieroglyphs, the past, present, and future existed in one frame. They didn't obsess over progress. They didn't fear decline. They lived in cycles, not timelines. In seasons, not deadlines. That mindset allowed them to breathe easier, move slower, and leave behind something far stronger than speed: permanence. A temple took decades to complete. Tombs were carved by hand, with care and repetition. Each stroke mattered. There was no shortcut. No rush to finish. They believed the gods noticed not how quickly something was done, but how mindfully. They measured worth in devotion, not in duration. Even the most powerful pharaoh, once buried, became part of a much bigger story. No ruler could outlive the river. No name could overshadow the stars. In Egypt, greatness was not loud. It was lasting. And to last, it had to be quiet. The desert has always known this. It doesn't shift with haste. It waits. The sands of Egypt, the winds across Thebes, the calm hush of the Valley of the Kings, they've seen dynasties rise and vanish. They hold no preference. Only memory. Egypt's story was not written in climaxes. It was written in the daily act of remembering. Of placing a pebble on a grave. Of preparing bread the same way your grandmother once did. Of whispering a prayer before sleep, not for something new, but for another day of the same peaceful rhythm. We might ask, what does Egypt teach us, now, in our fast world? Maybe it's the value of stillness. Of doing the same task, not out of boredom, but because it's right. Because it connects you to others. To the land. To time itself. Maybe it's the comfort of routine. Of waking at dawn. Of lighting a lamp at dusk. Of trusting the flow of days instead of trying to race through them. Or maybe it's just this, that even in the quietest civilizations, where nothing seems urgent, everything still matters. A farmer's footsteps through a flooded field. A child's laughter under a palm tree. A pot placed gently on a shelf. These are the moments that truly last. Not because they're loud, but because they're real. And in Egypt, they knew that better than most. they knew that eternity doesn't begin after death. It begins in the way you live. In the way you wake up. In the way you speak kindly. In the way you accept each sunrise as both ordinary and sacred. So now, as you rest, perhaps already drifting off, imagine not a monument, not a battle, but a single candle burning in a dark room. A scribe writing slowly on a piece of papyrus. A grandmother telling her grandchild the story of Ra, and the sun's journey through the sky. No drama. No danger. Just calm. Because in the end, history doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be remembered. And Egypt. It remembers itself. Quietly. Forever.